Richard Hartwell had always believed that success meant being busy. The busier you were, the more important you were. At 47 years old, he'd built an empire from nothing. Real estate, tech investments, startup companies. His fingerprints were everywhere in the business world. But his actual fingerprints? Those were rarely found in his own home anymore. His mansion sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured land in an exclusive neighborhood, where the houses were so far apart you couldn't hear your neighbors even if you tried. It was the kind of place that appeared in luxury home magazines. Marble floors that echoed with every footstep. A chandelier in the entrance hall that cost more than most people's cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows that let in streams of sunlight, illuminating rooms that mostly sat empty. Richard spent maybe 2 weeks a month actually living there. The rest of his time was consumed by meetings in New York, conferences in Los Angeles, deals in Chicago, and international trips that had him crossing time zones like most people crossed streets. His calendar was color-coded and managed by 2 different assistants. His life was efficient, profitable, and incredibly lonely, though he'd never admit that last part to anyone. The house wasn't completely empty when he was gone, of course. There was Maria, his maidservant. She'd been working for him for almost 3 years now. He'd hired her through an agency, barely glancing at her resume before approving it. As long as the house was clean when he returned and nothing went missing, he didn't need to know much else. Maria was the kind of employee Richard appreciated most, quiet, efficient, and invisible. She did her job without complaints or requests for raises or time off. When he was home, she moved through the house like a ghost, cleaning around him, preparing meals he barely tasted before rushing to his next video call. They rarely spoke beyond basic instructions. He paid her well, or at least he thought he did, and that was enough. That's how these things worked, right? This particular Tuesday morning started like any other business trip. Richard was in Singapore, sitting through yet another corporate merger meeting in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor. The city stretched out below him, glittering and modern, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on quarterly projections and profit margins. Then his phone buzzed. The lead investor had pulled out. The deal was off. Just like that, 2 weeks of scheduled meetings evaporated into nothing. Richard's assistant scrambled to rebook his flight. By noon, he was heading to the airport. By evening, he was somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, watching movies he didn't really pay attention to and drinking whiskey he didn't really taste. By the next afternoon, Wednesday, his driver was picking him up from the airport and heading toward his mansion. He hadn't called ahead. Why would he? The house was his house. Maria worked for him. There was no need to announce his arrival like he was some kind of guest. The drive from the airport usually gave him time to decompress, to shift from business mode to home mode, though honestly, he wasn't sure he had a home mode anymore. Today, though, he felt restless, annoyed about the failed deal, frustrated about wasted time, already thinking about which projects he could pivot to now that his schedule had opened up unexpectedly. When the car turned onto his street, Richard barely looked up from his phone. He was reading emails, already planning tomorrow's calls. But as they pulled into his circular driveway, something caught his attention. Something that didn't belong. His perfectly maintained lawn, the one that a professional service came to manicure twice a week, had toys on it. Actual children's toys. A bright red tricycle lay on its side near the fountain. A small plastic swimming pool, the kind you could buy at any discount store, sat deflated near the garden. And the walkway, his expensive stone walkway, was covered in colorful chalk drawings, stick figures holding hands, a rainbow, a wobbly house with a smoking chimney. Richard stared through the car window, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. Had some neighbors' kids wandered onto his property? Had Maria's family come to visit without permission? His hands tightened around his phone. "Sir?" his driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "It's fine, just wait here for a moment." Richard stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and somewhere nearby he could hear sounds. Voices. Children's voices, and they were coming from inside his house. He walked toward the front door slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. None of them were good. Had Maria turned his home into some kind of unauthorized daycare? Was she running a business behind his back, using his property without permission? The anger started building in his chest, hot and tight. The front door was unlocked, another thing that annoyed him. He pushed it open and stepped into the entrance hall. The sounds grew louder now. Children laughing, someone clapping rhythmically, music playing softly in the background. It was all coming from the direction of his living room. Richard moved through his own house like he was entering enemy territory, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. The closer he got to the living room, the more details he noticed. Small backpacks lined up against the wall in the hallway, each labeled with what looked like children's names written in marker. A bulletin board he'd never seen before hanging near the entrance to the living room, covered in colorful drawings and gold star stickers, the faint smell of sandwiches and fruit, like someone had recently prepared lunch for a crowd. He reached the doorway to the living room and stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw actually dropped. His luxury living room, the one with furniture that cost more than some people's yearly salary, the one he'd had professionally decorated by someone famous whose name he couldn't even remember, had been completely transformed. The expensive leather couches had been pushed against the walls. Colorful cushions, definitely not his, were arranged in a semicircle on his pristine floor. And sitting on those cushions were children. Lots of children. He counted quickly, maybe 15 of them, ranging from tiny kids who couldn't be older than 5 to preteens who looked around 11 or 12. They were dressed in clothes that had clearly seen better days. Worn sneakers, faded jeans, t-shirts with old cartoon characters. But their faces were bright and focused, all of them staring at the front of the room where a large whiteboard, where had that come from, stood on an easel. And there, standing in front of that whiteboard with a marker in her hand, was Maria. She was in the middle of teaching. Actually teaching. She was explaining something about fractions, drawing diagrams and asking questions that the children eagerly answered by raising their hands. Her voice was different than he'd ever heard it, confident, warm, animated. She smiled as she called on a small boy who shyly gave his answer. She praised a girl who solved a problem correctly. She was completely in her element. Through the archway to his formal dining room, Richard could see more transformations. His expensive dining table was covered in books. Actual library books stacked in neat piles with handwritten labels. Reading level 1, reading level 2, math practice, science fun. His dining room had become a library, and his kitchen, he could see through to it from where he stood, showed signs of having fed this entire group. Empty sandwich trays, cut-up fruit platters, a stack of small plastic cups. Someone had made lunch for 15 children in his kitchen. Richard stood there in his own doorway, invisible to the room full of students and their teacher, trying to understand what he was seeing. Trying to figure out how long this had been going on, trying to decide if he should be furious or something else, something he couldn't quite name. He must have made a sound or shifted his weight or something, because suddenly a little girl sitting closest to the door looked up. Her eyes went wide. She tugged on Maria's sleeve urgently, unable to form words. Maria turned, following the girl's gaze. The marker fell from her hand, clattering on the floor. The color drained from her face so quickly Richard almost thought she might faint. Every child in the room turned to look at what had scared their teacher so badly. And there he stood. Richard Hartwell, the millionaire, the owner of the house. 3 days early, catching everything red-handed. The room fell into complete silence. Even the music seemed to stop, though that might have just been Richard's imagination. Maria's hands started trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she managed to speak. "Mr. Hartwell, you're home early." Richard didn't respond. He just stood there looking at his maidservant, at the children, at his transformed mansion, and wondering what exactly he was supposed to do next. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The children sat frozen on their cushions, their eyes wide and darting between Richard and Maria. Some of them looked scared. Others looked confused. One little boy near the back started quietly gathering his things like he was preparing to run. Maria's face had gone from pale white to a splotchy red. She wrung her hands together, her breathing quick and shallow. Richard could see her struggling to decide what to say, what to do. Should she apologize? Should she explain? Should she just grab the children and leave? Richard himself wasn't sure what he was feeling. Anger, yes, that was definitely there. This woman had violated his trust, used his property without permission, brought strangers into his home. He had every right to fire her on the spot. maybe even press charges. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite identify. Confusion? Curiosity? He pushed those feelings aside and focused on the anger. Anger was simpler. "Children," Maria finally said, her voice cracking. "Please go outside with Rita, now." A teenage girl Richard hadn't noticed before stood up from where she'd been sitting in the corner with a book. She was maybe 16 or 17, with the same dark hair and eyes as Maria. Her daughter, Richard realized. The girl moved, quickly, efficiently, shepherding the younger children toward the back door that led to the garden. But Miss Maria... One boy started to protest. Outside. "Please, Rita will stay with you." Maria's voice was firmer now, though her hands were still shaking. The children filed out quietly, some of them glancing back with worried expressions. The teenage girl, Rita, gave her mother a long look before following them out. Through the windows, Richard could see her gathering the kids in the garden, trying to distract them with a game. Then it was just the two of them, Richard and Maria. Standing in his transformed living room with its scattered cushions and educational posters and that whiteboard with half-finished fraction problems still drawn on it. Maria turned to face him fully. She straightened her shoulders, though Richard could see the effort it took. When she spoke, her voice was steadier than he expected. "Before you say anything," she began, "I know what I did was wrong. I know I violated your trust. I had no right to bring anyone into your home without your permission. I'll leave immediately. Today. Right now if you want. And I'll pay you back for any damages or anything that was used or..." "Stop." Richard held up his hand. He walked further into the room, his eyes scanning everything. The cushions. The books. The whiteboard. He picked up one of the notebooks lying on the floor. It was filled with a child's handwriting. Math problems carefully solved, some with gold star stickers next to them. "Just stop talking for a minute." Maria went silent. Her lips pressed together. She looked like she might cry, but was fighting it with everything she had. Richard set the notebook down and turned to face her. His voice was controlled, measured, the same voice he used in board meetings. "How long has this been going on?" 6 months, Maria whispered. 6 months. Richard repeated it slowly, letting the weight of it sink in. Half a year. This had been happening for half a year and he'd had no idea. How many days a week? 3. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. From 3 in the afternoon until 6 in the evening. Richard did some quick math in his head. That was a lot of days, a lot of children in his house, a lot of deception. And you thought you could just keep doing this? That I'd never find out? You're almost never home. The words came out before Maria could stop them. She immediately looked horrified, like she'd just made everything worse. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. You're always traveling and I thought..." "You thought what? That because I'm not here, this isn't my house anymore? That you could just do whatever you wanted?" "No." Maria's voice rose, then she caught herself, glancing toward the windows where the children were playing. She lowered her voice again. "No, Mr. Hartwell, I never thought that. I knew it was wrong every single time. I knew I could lose my job. I knew you'd be angry if you found out. But I didn't know what else to do. Sit down." Richard gestured to one of the pushed-aside couches. "And explain to me what's going on. All of it. From the beginning." Maria hesitated, then sat on the very edge of the couch, perched like she might need to bolt at any second. Richard remained standing, his arms crossed, waiting. She took a deep breath and began. 6 months ago, the community center in my neighborhood shut down, budget cuts. They couldn't afford to keep it open anymore. Her words came slowly at first, then faster as the story poured out. That center ran an after-school program. It wasn't much, but it gave kids a safe place to go after school, while their parents were still at work. A place to do homework, get help if they needed it, just be kids without being on the streets. Richard didn't interrupt. He just listened. When it closed, all those children had nowhere to go. Some of them were staying home alone. 8-year-olds trying to take care of 5-year-olds. Some were just wandering around the neighborhood, getting into trouble because there was nothing else to do. Their parents were working double shifts, trying to make ends meet. They couldn't afford private daycare or tutors or any of those things. Maria's voice grew more passionate as she spoke, her hands gesturing despite her nervousness. I saw them every day in my neighborhood. Kids sitting on street corners with their backpacks, trying to do homework on the sidewalk. Teenagers watching. The younger ones, missing their own schoolwork because they had to babysit. And the parents. You could see how worried they were, but what could they do? Someone had to pay the rent. So you decided to help, Richard said. It wasn't a question. I started small, just 3 kids in my apartment, helping them with homework after school. But word spread fast in the neighborhood. More parents asked if I could watch their children. More kids needed help. Within a month, I had 15 children coming to my apartment 3 days a week. Why 3 days? Because that's all the space I had, all the time I could manage. The other days, I clean houses in the neighborhood to pay for supplies, books, paper, pencils, snacks for the kids. My salary from you covers rent and bills for me and Rita, but not extras. Richard absorbed this information. Maria had essentially been running 2 jobs, one for him, one for these kids, and paying for everything out of her own pocket. My landlord started complaining about the noise, Maria continued. Too many children coming and going. The neighbors below us said it was too loud. He threatened to evict me if I didn't stop. But these kids, Mr. Hartwell, some of them are so smart, so eager to learn. They just need someone to help them, someone to believe in them. I couldn't just abandon them. So you brought them here. Maria nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was betraying your trust, but you're gone so much and this house is so big, and it just sits here empty most of the time. I thought if I was really careful, if I cleaned everything perfectly after each session, if I made sure nothing was damaged or moved. You thought I'd never know. Yes. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. And I'm so sorry. I should have asked. I should have told you. But I was afraid you'd say no, and these children need this so badly. Richard walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The children were playing a game, running and laughing under Rita's supervision. They looked happy, safe, normal kids being normal kids. The little boy who'd scraped his knee earlier was being tended to by an older girl who was carefully applying a bandage from a first aid kit. Before you worked for me, Richard asked, still looking out the window. What did you do? I studied to be a teacher, Maria said quietly. Back in my country before I came here, I was in university studying education. But then my husband died, and I had Rita to take care of, and life happened. I needed money fast, not a degree that would take years. So I started cleaning houses. It paid the bills. Richard turned back to face her. You gave up teaching to clean houses. I gave up teaching to feed my daughter, Maria corrected gently. I don't regret it. Rita is everything to me. But yes, I always thought maybe someday when she was older, when things were more stable, I could go back to school, finish my degree, become the teacher I wanted to be. Instead, you became one anyway. Just without the degree or the pay? Maria managed a small, sad smile. I suppose so, though not for much longer, obviously. I understand if you want me to leave right now. I can have all of this cleaned up within an hour. The cushions are mine. The whiteboard I bought secondhand. The books are from library donations. I'll take everything with me. You'll never know we were here. Richard walked over to the whiteboard and studied the fraction problems written there. The handwriting was neat, the explanations clear. This wasn't just babysitting. This was real teaching. Quality education being offered for free to kids who probably weren't getting much help anywhere else. He thought about his own childhood. His mother, working 3 jobs. Coming home to an empty apartment every day after school. Doing his homework. Alone at the kitchen table, struggling with problems nobody was there to explain. Getting into trouble with the wrong crowd because there was nothing else to do. Nowhere else to go. He thought about the mentors who'd eventually found him. The teachers who stayed late to help. The scholarship that changed his life. The opportunities. That had seemed impossible until someone decided to invest in a kid from a poor neighborhood who just needed a chance. He looked at Maria, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in 3 years. This woman who cleaned his house and cooked his meals and asked for nothing, who'd been running a secret school in his living room for 6 months, spending her own money, her own time, her own energy, just to help kids who reminded her of her own struggles. The anger was still there. The violation of trust was real. But something else was there too, growing stronger. Something like respect. Something like recognition. How many of these kids are actually behind in school? He asked. Maria looked surprised by the question. When they started? About half were failing at least one subject now. Only 2 are still struggling, and they're improving every week. Richard nodded slowly. He walked back to the couch and sat down, not across from Maria but near her, close enough that she looked nervous again. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice calm and measured. You're not fired. Maria's eyes went wide. What? You're not fired, Richard repeated. But we are going to make some changes around here. Maria stared at Richard like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No words came out. She clearly couldn't process what she'd just heard. I don't understand, she finally managed to say. You're not... I'm not fired? No, Richard said simply. He leaned back against the couch, a piece of furniture he'd probably sat on less than 5 times since buying it. But if you're going to run a school in my house, we're going to do it properly. A school. Maria's voice was barely a whisper now. Mr. Hartwell, I don't think you understand what I understand perfectly. Richard cut her off, but his tone wasn't harsh. It was thoughtful, measured. You've been running an unofficial after-school program for underprivileged children. You've been doing it in secret because you had no other option. You've been spending your own money on supplies. And from what I can see, you've been doing a pretty decent job of it. Maria looked like she might pass out. This clearly wasn't how she'd expected this conversation to go. But why? Why would you allow this? Richard was quiet for a moment. He looked around the living room again, at the cushions and books and that whiteboard with its half-finished lessons. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Maria had ever heard it. When I was 9 years old, I came home every day to an empty apartment. My mother worked from 6 in the morning until 9 at night, sometimes later. I'd let myself in with the key she kept hidden under the mat, and I'd sit at our tiny kitchen table trying to figure out homework that might as well have been written in code. Maria stayed silent, sensing that Richard needed to say this. I started hanging out with the wrong kids, the ones who didn't go home either because there was nobody there, or because home wasn't a safe place to be. By the time I was 12, I was shoplifting. Small stuff at first, candy bars, magazines, then bigger things. I thought I was tough. I thought I was smart. He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. Then I got caught. The store owner could have called the police. Probably should have. Instead, he called a friend of his who ran a youth mentorship program. That friend, Mr. Chen, he showed up at the police station and vouched for me, told them he'd take responsibility. What did he do? Maria asked softly. He made me work off what I'd stolen by helping at the community center after school. Cleaning, organizing supplies, whatever needed doing. But while I was there, I met tutors. Teachers who volunteered their time. They helped me with homework. Taught me that I wasn't stupid. I just needed someone to explain things in a way that made sense. Richard stood up and walked to the window again, watching the children play outside. Mr. Chen paid for my SAT prep course, helped me apply for scholarships, wrote recommendation letters. I got into college on a full scholarship because that man decided I was worth saving, because he saw potential in a kid who was heading down a really dark path. He turned back to Maria. I built my entire fortune on the foundation that man gave me. And you know what I've done with it? Bought expensive things, traveled constantly, lived in a mansion that's basically a museum. I've donated to charities, sure, but always from a distance. Write a check, get a tax deduction, never actually see where the money goes or who it helps. Maria's eyes were glistening with tears again, but she was smiling slightly now. Then I come home early and find out my maidservant has been running the exact kind of program that saved my life. Right here under my nose, and I almost fired her for it. Richard shook his head. That would have been incredibly stupid of me. Mr. Hartwell, let me finish. He held up a hand. You asked why I'm allowing this. I'm not allowing it. I'm funding it. Properly. We're going to turn this into a real after-school program. Legal, organized, everything above board. Maria's hand went to her mouth. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I've already been thinking about it while we've been talking. This house has plenty of space. The entire ground floor can be converted into a learning center. We'll need proper furniture, more supplies, maybe hire another teacher or two to help you. Another teacher? Maria looked overwhelmed. But I never finished my degree. Then we'll pay for you to finish it. Online classes, night school, whatever works. In the meantime, you're doing a good job with what you have. These kids trust you. Their parents trust you. That's worth more than a piece of paper. Maria stood up suddenly, pacing now, her hands gesturing wildly. This is crazy. This is... Mr. Hartwell, do you understand what you're saying? Converting your house into a learning center? The permits alone, the insurance, the liability. I have lawyers for that, Richard said calmly. Good lawyers. Expensive lawyers who I pay way too much money to sit around waiting for me to need them. They can handle the paperwork. But your house. This is your home. Richard looked around the living room with its pushed-aside furniture and children's cushions scattered on the floor. Is it, though? I spend maybe 6 nights a month here. The rest of the time it just sits empty. What's the point of having all this space if nobody's using it? Your friends, your business associates, what will they think? I don't care what they think. Richard surprised himself with how true that statement was. Most of them are either too busy counting their money or trying to impress each other. If they have a problem with me actually doing something useful with my wealth, that's their issue, not mine. Maria sank back onto the couch, her head in her hands. I can't believe this is happening. This morning I woke up thinking it was just another normal day, and now you're going to run a proper after-school program. Richard pulled out his phone. I'm going to make some calls. We'll need contractors to make some modifications to the space. Nothing major, just making it more functional for learning. Better lighting, maybe some built-in shelving, proper desks instead of cushions on the floor. The cushions work fine, Maria protested weakly. The cushions are a tripping hazard and probably terrible for their backs. Richard countered. We'll get proper seating that's still comfortable and age-appropriate. And that kitchen, we're going to stock it properly. Real snacks, healthy meals, not just sandwiches you're throwing together from whatever's in my fridge. Mr. Hartwell, this is too much. The cost of Maria. Richard looked at her directly. I made $17 million last year. And you know what I did with most of it? Invested it to make more money that I don't need and won't spend. This is the first time in years that spending money has actually felt meaningful. Maria wiped her eyes, leaving mascara smudges she didn't seem to notice. What about the children? We can't just tell them tomorrow that everything's changing. Some of them get anxious with change, and their parents will have questions. Good point. We should meet with the parents. Explain what we're doing. Make sure they're comfortable with it. This needs to be transparent. Richard was already making notes on his phone. Can you set up a meeting? Maybe this weekend? Yes, I can do that. Maria still looked like she was in shock, but she was starting to smile now, really smile. There are 15 families total. Some have more than one child in the program. 15 families, okay, we'll have the meeting here. Saturday afternoon work for you? Saturday is perfect. Richard continued planning out loud the same way he did when putting together a business deal. We'll need to set up a proper nonprofit organization. That'll take a few weeks with the paperwork, but we can start making improvements right away. How many children do you think you could handle with proper space and maybe 1 or 2 assistant teachers? Maria thought about it. With help? Maybe 40 or 50? There's such a need in the neighborhood. I have a waiting list of families who've asked if they can join. A waiting list. You have a waiting list and you're running this out of cushions on my floor. Richard actually laughed, a sound that startled both of them. Maria, you're either incredibly brave or completely crazy. Probably both, she admitted with a small laugh of her own. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing what had just happened. Outside, the children's laughter drifted through the windows. The sun was starting to move lower in the sky, casting golden light across the scattered cushions and abandoned textbooks. Can I ask you something? Maria said quietly. Of course. Why now? You could have done something like this years ago. Set up a foundation, funded programs, helped kids in need. Why does finding out about my secret school change everything? Richard considered the question carefully. I think because it was real. Not some abstract charity on paper, but actual children playing in my garden. You standing at that whiteboard. teaching fractions with such passion that you didn't even notice I'd walked in. It wasn't a tax write-off or a press release. It was life happening in my empty house, and I realized this is what the space should be used for. He stood up and offered Maria his hand. Come on. Let's go tell those kids outside that they don't have to leave. Let's tell them they can come back on Friday. And on Monday, and every day we have the program running. Maria took his hand and stood, her grip firm despite her tears. Mr. Hartwell, I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by making this work. By helping those kids the way Mr. Chen helped me. And please, if we're going to be working together on this, you need to stop calling me Mr. Hartwell. Richard is fine. I'll try, Maria said, though they both knew it would take her a while to break that habit. They walked toward the back door together, ready to deliver news that would change 15 children's lives. Neither of them fully realized yet that it would change their lives too, in ways they couldn't possibly predict. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to know that something good was about to begin, something that would grow far beyond what either of them could imagine. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of activity that Richard hadn't experienced since his earliest days, building his first company. But this time the exhaustion felt different, better somehow, like he was actually building something that mattered. The Saturday meeting with the parents had been more emotional than Richard expected. 15 families crowded into his living room, mothers still in their work uniforms from restaurant jobs, fathers with construction dust still on their boots, a grandmother who'd taken 3 buses to get there. They'd sat on his expensive furniture looking uncomfortable and suspicious, wondering why some rich man was suddenly interested in their children. Maria had done most of the talking at first, explaining what Richard wanted to do. The parents listened quietly, their faces unreadable. Then the questions started coming, rapid fire and honest. What's the catch? One mother asked bluntly. Nobody does something like this for free. There's no catch, Richard had assured her. I want to fund an after-school program. Your children get free tutoring, supervision, and meals. That's it. For how long? A father pressed. Until you get bored? Until it's not fun anymore? My kids don't need another disappointment in their lives. That question had hit Richard harder than he expected. He'd thought about it carefully before answering. I'm setting this up as a permanent nonprofit organization. Even if something happens to me, the program will continue. I'm putting enough money into a trust to fund it for at least 10 years, and I'm working on getting additional donors after that. The grandmother had spoken up then, her voice shaky but firm. My grandson, he's been coming to Miss Maria for 4 months now. He was failing math. Now he's getting B's. He comes home excited about school. I haven't seen that since his father passed. If you're serious about helping these kids, then God bless you, sir. They need this. One by one, the parents had shared similar stories. Children struggling in school who were now thriving. Kids who'd been getting into trouble who now had somewhere safe to be. Parents who could work their shifts without constant worry about what their children were doing. By the end of the meeting, there were tears and handshakes and a few fierce hugs for Maria. The parents had agreed, though Richard could tell some were still cautiously optimistic, waiting to see if he'd actually follow through. He did. The contractors started work the following Monday. Richard had initially wanted to completely renovate the ground floor, but Maria had talked him down from the more extravagant plans. They compromised on modifications that would make the space functional without losing the comfortable, home-like feeling that made the kids relax. The living room got a fresh coat of cheerful yellow paint that Maria picked out. Built-in shelving went up along 2 walls for books and supplies. The expensive furniture was moved to storage. We'll sell it and use the money for supplies, Richard had suggested, though Maria insisted on at least keeping some of it. They brought in proper tables and chairs sized for children, with cushioned seats in bright colors. A reading corner was created by the window with beanbags and a small bookshelf at kid height. The dining room was transformed into a dedicated library and quiet study space. More bookshelves lined the walls, and Richard had spent an absurd amount of money buying books. Not just textbooks, but fiction, science books, biographies, graphic novels, anything that might spark a child's interest in reading. Maria had to physically stop him from buying an entire bookstore's worth of inventory. Richard, we need space for the children too, not just books, she'd laughed. It was the first time she'd called him by his first name without immediately apologizing. The kitchen got upgraded with equipment that could handle feeding 50 kids. A commercial-grade refrigerator, additional counter space storage for bulk supplies. Richard hired a part-time cook, Mrs. Chen, a retired school cafeteria worker who knew how to make healthy food that kids would actually eat. But the biggest change was in the converted sunroom at the back of the house. It became a multi-purpose space, an art area with easels and supplies, a science corner with microscopes and experiment kits, a computer station with 6 laptops for the older kids to practice typing and research skills. Windows on 3 sides let in natural light, making it the brightest, most cheerful room in the house. During all the construction chaos, the program continued. The children worked around the contractors, sometimes getting impromptu lessons in carpentry and electrical work from the workers. One contractor spent his lunch break every day helping a struggling reader practice. Claiming his own dyslexia made him understand the kids' frustration. Richard found himself canceling business trips to be there for the renovations. Then he started canceling them just to be there for the kids. He'd tell himself he was just checking on his investment, making sure the program ran smoothly. But the truth was simpler and more surprising. He enjoyed being there. He started arriving on program days around 4 in the afternoon, telling himself he'd just stay for half an hour. Those half hours turned into full hours, then entire afternoons. He'd watch Maria teach, impressed by how she could explain complex concepts in simple ways, how she never got frustrated with repeated questions, how she celebrated every small victory like it was a major breakthrough. The children were wary of him at first. This tall, serious man in expensive clothes who owned the house and walked around observing everything. But gradually they warmed up to him. It started with simple questions. "Mister, why do you have so many rooms?" a 7-year-old girl asked one day. "That's a good question. I don't really know," Richard admitted. "I think I just bought a big house because I could, not because I needed it." "That's silly," she said matter-of-factly, and somehow Richard couldn't disagree. The breakthrough came 3 weeks in when a 10-year-old boy named Tommy approached him in the computer room. Tommy was small for his age, quiet, with thick glasses that were held together with tape on one side. "Mr. Richard, Miss Maria says you know about business and money and stuff." "I suppose I do," Richard said cautiously. "Could you teach me?" "Not now, but sometime. I want to start my own company when I grow up." Richard felt something shift in his chest. "What kind of company?" "I don't know yet. But something that helps people. Like what you're doing here, but different." Tommy pushed his glasses up nervously. "Miss Maria says you started with nothing and built everything yourself. I want to do that too." "Tell you what," Richard said, making a decision on the spot. "How about every Wednesday I come in early and we have a business basics class? Anyone who's interested can join. We'll talk about entrepreneurship, finance, how business actually works." Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You'd do that?" "Really. But you have to keep your math grades up. Business requires a lot of math." "Deal." Tommy ran off to tell his friends, and by Wednesday, Richard had 12 eager students ranging from age 9 to 14 waiting for his first lesson. That first class was humbling. Richard, who'd given presentations to Fortune 500 executives without breaking a sweat, found himself stumbling through an explanation of supply and demand to a group of kids who asked questions he'd never considered. "But if you're just trying to make money, aren't you being greedy?" one girl asked. "How do you know if you're charging a fair price or ripping people off?" Another wanted to know, "What if your business hurts the environment? Is it okay to make money if it damages the planet?" These weren't abstract questions to them. These were kids who'd seen their parents struggle with low wages, unfair bosses, and companies that didn't care about communities. They wanted to learn business, but they also wanted to learn how to do it ethically, how to build something that made money and did good. Richard found himself questioning things he'd taken for granted his entire career. He researched answers between classes. He brought in books about social entrepreneurship and ethical business practices. The kids challenged him, and he loved it. Maria hired 2 assistant teachers with the budget Richard provided. One was a retired elementary school teacher named Mr. Patel, who specialized in reading comprehension. The other was a young college graduate named Ashley, who was brilliant with science and math. They both worked part-time, allowing Maria to focus on program coordination and the students who needed the most attention. Rita, Maria's daughter, started helping out too. She was saving for college but refused to take money from Richard. "I want to earn it," she insisted, so he put her on the payroll as a teacher's aide. She was naturally gifted with the younger children, patient and creative in ways that reminded Richard of her mother. The program grew from 15 children to 25 within the first month. Then 30, then 40. Maria had to start a real waiting list and establish criteria for admission. Children who needed it most, who had working parents and no other after-school options, who were struggling academically or socially. The local news caught wind of what was happening and wanted to do a story. Richard initially agreed, thinking it might help attract donations from others. But when the reporter showed up and started asking questions that felt invasive, wanting to film the children, asking about their family situations, he shut it down. "These kids aren't a publicity opportunity," he told the disappointed reporter. "They're just kids trying to learn. They don't need cameras in their faces." Maria had overheard and smiled at him after the reporter left. "You're getting protective of them. Is that wrong?" "No," she said gently. "It's exactly right." The thing that surprised Richard most wasn't how much time or money the program required. It was how much it gave back to him. Every afternoon he spent there, every breakthrough he witnessed, every excited kid who wanted to show him their improved test scores or share what they'd learned, it filled something in him he hadn't realized was empty. His business associates noticed the change. He was less available, less willing to drop everything for a meeting. One close friend asked him directly over lunch what was going on. "I'm spending time on something that actually matters," Richard explained. "I've spent 20 years building wealth. Now I want to spend time building people." His friend had laughed, thinking it was a phase. But Richard knew better. Something fundamental had shifted inside him that Wednesday afternoon when he'd come home early. He just hadn't realized how deep that shift would go. Not yet, anyway. That realization was still coming. 6 months after that unexpected Wednesday afternoon, Richard stood in what used to be his formal living room and barely recognized it. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't the physical changes that made it feel unfamiliar. It was the life pulsing through every corner of the space. Children's artwork covered the walls, paintings, drawings, science project posters, creative writing pieces. A bulletin board near the entrance displayed gold stars with names, celebrating achievements big and small. "Tommy got an A in math. Lisa read 5 books this month. Kevin helped a younger student without being asked." The sounds of learning and laughter had become so normal that the silence of his old, empty mansion now felt strange on the rare occasions when the center was closed. The Hartwell Learning Center, as it was officially registered, now served 47 children 5 days a week. What started as a desperate solution to a community problem had become something much bigger. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Parents who'd been skeptical at first now sang its praises. Teachers from the local schools reported that children in the program were showing remarkable improvement. Not just academically, but in confidence and social skills too. Richard's Wednesday business class had become the highlight of his week. His students, now numbering 18, had moved beyond basic concepts. They were creating actual business plans, pitching ideas to each other, learning about marketing and budgeting and problem solving. Tommy, the quiet boy who'd first asked for lessons, had designed a detailed plan for a community garden that would sell produce at affordable prices while teaching younger kids about nutrition and sustainability. "The profit margin is slim," Tommy explained during his presentation, "but that's okay because the real value is in community impact. Sometimes success isn't just about money, right, Mr. Richard?" Richard had smiled at that, recognizing his own earlier words reflected back at him by a 10-year-old who understood them better than most adults he knew. "Exactly right, Tommy, exactly right. But it wasn't just about the business class or the improved test scores or the smooth operation of the center. Something deeper had changed, both in the mansion and in Richard himself. He'd restructured his entire work life. Meetings that used to be in person were now video calls. Business trips were cut in half and scheduled around the center's needs. His assistants had strict instructions. Unless it was a genuine emergency, he was unavailable on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons. His business partners thought he'd lost his mind. His accountant worried about the money he was pouring into what she called a charity project, with no return on investment. But Richard knew better. The return was everywhere in ways that couldn't be calculated on a spreadsheet. Like the afternoon he found 9-year-old Kelly crying in the reading corner. She was clutching a book, tears streaming down her face. Richard's first instinct was to find Maria, but Kelly had grabbed his hand. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, sitting down beside her awkwardly. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with crying children. Nothing's wrong, Kelly had said, wiping her eyes. The book is just really good. The girl in the story, she's like me. She doesn't have a dad either, and she's scared a lot, but she keeps being brave anyway. I didn't know books could be about people like me. Richard had felt his throat tighten. Books can be about everyone. That's the magic of them. You can find yourself in stories, or you can find who you want to become. Is that why you have so many books here? Yes, so every kid can find the story that speaks to them. Kelly had hugged him then, spontaneously, and Richard had frozen for a moment before carefully hugging her back. After she ran off to tell her friends about the book, he'd sat in that reading corner for a long time, understanding something he'd never quite grasped before. Wealth wasn't about what you accumulated. It was about what you gave away that actually mattered. Maria had been accepted into an online degree completion program. She took classes late at night after the center closed, working toward the teaching certificate she'd abandoned years ago. Richard had offered to pay for it, but she'd refused at first. "You're already doing so much," she'd protested. "Maria, you're running a learning center that's changing lives. The least I can do is help you get the credentials that recognize what you already are, an excellent teacher." She'd finally agreed, though she insisted on paying half herself. "I need to earn it too," she'd said, and Richard respected that. Rita had started college with a full scholarship Richard had helped her apply for. She still came back on weekends to volunteer, bringing her roommate who'd started teaching an art class. The center was becoming more than just Maria's project or Richard's funding. It was becoming a community effort, with volunteers contributing time, local businesses donating supplies, and parents helping however they could. One parent who was a carpenter built beautiful bookshelves for the library. Another who owned a small bakery started providing fresh bread twice a week. A retired nurse volunteered to teach a basic health and first aid class. People wanted to be part of something good, Richard realized. They just needed someone to create the opportunity. The moment that changed everything for Richard came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October. He was in his home office upstairs, the only part of the house that remained purely his, when he heard a knock. Maria stood in the doorway holding an envelope. "This came today," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought you should see it." Richard opened the envelope and found a letter from the local school district. It was from the superintendent, requesting a meeting to discuss the Hartwell Learning Center's methods and curriculum. They wanted to understand why children in the program were showing such significant improvement. "They want to potentially model other after-school programs on what we're doing," Maria explained. "Richard, we could help design programs for schools across the entire district." Richard read the letter twice, then looked up at Maria. 6 months ago, she'd been a maidservant hiding her teaching in his living room, terrified of being caught. Now she was being recognized by the school district as an education innovator. "This is incredible, Maria. You should be so proud." "We should be proud," she corrected gently. "None of this happens without you opening your home and your heart." That word, heart, stuck with Richard after Maria left. He stood at his office window looking down at the center below. Through the rain-streaked glass he could see children working at tables, Mr. Patel reading to a small group, Ashley demonstrating a science experiment that made kids laugh with delight. His phone rang. A business contact calling about a potential acquisition deal worth millions. He let it go to voicemail. There would be time for business later. Right now, he wanted to go downstairs and see what the kids were learning today. As Richard headed down the stairs, he passed the spot where he'd stood 6 months ago, frozen in shock at the scene in his living room. If someone had told him that day how completely his life would change, he wouldn't have believed them. He'd been so focused on protecting his space, his possessions, his carefully ordered world. Now his space was filled with children's laughter. His possessions were being used to create something meaningful. And his carefully ordered world had been beautifully disrupted in ways he never could have imagined. He walked into the main learning area and immediately got pulled into helping with a geography project. 3 kids needed to know about different countries' economies for a presentation. As Richard explained trade and exports in simple terms, answering their endless questions, he caught Maria's eye across the room. She smiled at him, that knowing smile that said she understood exactly what he was feeling. Later that evening, after the last child had been picked up and the center was quiet, Richard and Maria sat in the reading corner with cups of coffee. reviewing plans for the next month. You know, Richard said thoughtfully, people keep asking me why I did this, why I turned my house into a learning center. They think there must be some angle, some benefit I'm getting. And what do you tell them? I tell them the truth. That I came home early one day and couldn't believe what my maidservant had done. That she'd turned my empty house into something meaningful. That she reminded me what actually matters. Maria blushed slightly. I just did what needed to be done. Exactly. You saw a need and filled it even when it was risky and scary. You taught me that having wealth means nothing if you're not using it to make life better for others. You showed me that the greatest return on investment isn't money. It's lives changed. Potential unlocked. Futures made brighter. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The kind of silence that only exists between people who've worked together towards something meaningful. So what's next? Maria asked. The district wants to meet. We have that waiting list of 30 more kids. The college called asking if we'd host student teachers. Richard smiled. Next, we figure out how to expand. Maybe open another center in a different neighborhood. Maybe train other people to do what you're doing. The possibilities are endless, Maria. Endless, she repeated, shaking her head in wonder. 6 months ago, I was hiding this from you. Now we're planning expansion. 6 months ago, I was living in an empty mansion, traveling constantly, thinking success meant having things. Now I understand that success means giving things away. Time, resources, opportunities. Richard gestured to the colorful, cluttered, perfect learning space around them. This is what success actually looks like. As Richard drove home that night, he'd rented an apartment nearby since the mansion was now the center. He thought about the businessman he'd been 6 months ago. That version of himself seemed like a stranger now, someone who'd confused accumulation with achievement, who'd mistaken isolation for independence. Coming home early that Wednesday had been the best accident of his life. It had led him to discover that his maidservant was running a secret school, yes, but more importantly, it had led him to discover what his own life had been missing: purpose, connection, and the simple joy of helping children become who they were meant to be. And that, Richard thought as he parked his car and headed into his modest apartment, was worth more than all the mansions in the world.